Okay, so last time we talked about Charlemagne and got a little bit into his empire. And I want to talk about some things that happened in the couple of centuries after the time of Charlemagne. Because this had a real impact on the way that war was conceived, the way that people engaged in warfare, and especially the relationship between Christianity and warfare that kind of defined what it meant to be a warrior and to engage in warfare in the Middle Ages, or at least in the High and Late Middle Ages. And so here you see the map of the lands that had at one time been part of Charlemagne's empire. The empire is also known as the Carolingian Empire because most of the key rulers of this were named Charles, which is Carolus in Latin, hence Carolingian. Okay. Charlemagne's grandsons, the sons of Louis the Pious, fought wars against each other, and they eventually arrived at a peace treaty where they decided to split up the empire into three parts. And you can see those three parts here. The oldest son, Lothar, took this middle portion, which included kind of access to Rome and Italy, and then also this region known as Lotharingia, which is now kind of the borderland between France and Germany. Also the location of, like the Low Countries and Luxembourg and places like that. And this wasn't very smart of Lothar because the Alps mountains run right in the middle of his kingdom. He has, or at least his heirs would have enemies potentially on both sides. And then the younger sons of Louis, Charles, the Bald is what he's called, took the western part, which became known as West Francia or the West Frankish Kingdom. And then his younger son Louis, known as Louis the German, took the eastern part. And quickly, this whole arrangement fell apart. For one, the eastern and western, kind of attacked the middle, and eventually Lotharingia was kind of divided up between the two. But it wasn't just the fighting between the various heirs of the Carolingian kings. It was also the nobles, right, who took advantage of this situation to seize control of smaller territories and to rule outright without much oversight of the kings. And so all of these lands you see on here became important duchies and counties and things like that. You have very powerful dukes up here in Saxony, for instance, who by the early 10th century declared themselves the kings of Germany and even eventually became crowned as emperors in the tradition of Charlemagne, who had that happen to him as well. You have powerful dukes down here in Bavaria, and then various nobles kind of all over these kingdoms, the Dukes of Burgundy, the Dukes of Aquitaine, right? These are very powerful people. And gradually the Carolingians died out and new kings took their place. The Capetian dynasty came to rule in France, but really the only territory the Capetians controlled for the first century or so of their dynasty was the area kind of immediately around Paris and a little bit south of there, right? The rest of this was in the control of powerful nobles like the Dukes of Aquitaine, the Dukes of Burgundy, the Counts of Champagne, and eventually the Dukes of Normandy, who we'll talk about in just a second here. And the same went to a lesser extent for the German lands over here, that even though first the Dukes of Saxony and later, some of the dynasties emerged from southern Germany, even though they were kings and even held the titles of emperor, these powerful nobles kept them at bay and ruled outright within their territories. And these nobles were constantly fighting with each other. And it wasn't just the powerful nobles either. It was lesser knights who were trying to wrest land from each other. And so violence was a near constant in the 9th and 10th century. And this was precipitated as well by invasions from outside. Okay, so the breakup of the Carolingian Empire is one factor in this, and then invasions from outside are another one. From the north, up here in Scandinavia, which is a little bit off the map, right, there were various peoples who lived up there who were not terribly cohesive, although some of them did have quite advanced structures of government. This is where arguably the world's first parliament structures emerge. But these people lived in territory where there was quite a short growing season, and even though they farmed, they often couldn't get enough of a living off of the land, so they supplemented that by sailing and raiding into surrounding territories. And with the breakup of the Carolingian Empire and with the weakening of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England, these, and they were called by various people the Northmen or the Normans. The word that they used to describe their activities was the word Viking, which is actually where that comes from. It's a kind of Norse word. And so they went Viking, they went raiding into these territories. And initially they would just kind of find the easy pickings like monasteries or unfortified settlements or even perhaps peasant dwellings where they had some grain stored or something like that. And they would raid these things. They would commit atrocities, right? The Vikings came to have a very bad reputation. Some of it's probably a little unearned, but this was a time of a lot of chaos. There was also an emboldened group of, or various groups of Muslims who attacked the southern part of this territory. There was a Muslim kingdom based in Sicily at this point. The Muslims made inroads into southern France. The port of Marseille, for instance, was in Muslim hands at various times during this period. And so, Muslims already controlled Iberia or Spain and most of the islands here in the Western Mediterranean. And so this was another major threat. And then from the east, there was a group of nomadic horsemen known as the Magyars. Here are the three directions, or the three groups of invaders, right? The Magyars, who would eventually settle down in what is now Hungary, and kind of become the main people of that land. But initially, they helped to destabilize the eastern part of this. The late 9th and most of the 10th century are times of upheaval, and the sources indicate an obsession with order because they didn't have it, right? They're constantly worried about how do we establish order in this world where there's so much chaos. And I don't want to put too fine a point on this. This was not entirely a time for every place. This was not always a time of chaos. There were some stable structures that emerged in some places, there are various rulers who actually are quite effective, including some of these Northmen. A Norman named Rollo becomes the first Duke of Normandy, for instance, and creates a stable duchy in the northern part of France. There is a Norse king named Canute who becomes Christian and establishes a fairly stable rule in England. Before him, you also have Alfred the Great, who was the last and not completely the last, but he's arguably the greatest of the Anglo-Saxon rulers, even though he lives in a time where Viking invasions were already happening to that territory. So there are some bright spots to this. But people are concerned about the endemic violence, right? This also coincides in time with the turn of the millennium, and as we talked about in class, there are a lot of concerns manifest all over Europe with the end of the world. The millennium's going to turn. It's shifting to the year 1000. It's 1,000 years since the coming of Christ, and so surely he's going to come again, and all of the calamities foretold in the book of Revelation are going to happen, right? So that's another thing that helps to create a lot of worry among people. And so one of the most interesting responses to this is a thing that has been called the world's first mass protest movement. I don't know if that's actually true. There are probably mass protests in earlier periods of time, ancient Rome, things like that. The Roman public tended to protest pretty loudly if they didn't like an emperor's decisions and things. But this is a curious phenomenon in that it emerges from people who are at least partly from people who are arguably powerless. The leaders of this protest movement, which is called the Peace of God movement, were the clergy. They were victimized by this. As I said, monasteries and churches often had a lot of wealth and little protection other than maybe guarantees from the local strongman who helped to build the church and who relied on the monks or the priests to pray for his soul and the soul of his family, right? But they were, with this onslaught and this of invasions and this endemic violence, these would-be protectors were often overwhelmed, and churches and monasteries suffered greatly. But the peasants suffered too. The farmers in the countryside, right? They armies passed through their fields and raided their food stores and left them in a state of starvation. This is almost certainly a period of great famine, which is, of course, one of the horsemen, one of the themes of this class, right? So we should recognize that, right? The common people, the farmers who work the land, are often the easiest and most tragic victims of a time of endemic violence like this. And so the peasants, according to many accounts, banded together and approached the clergy and said, can't you do something to protect us? And the clergy came up with some strategies that are detailed in a couple of the sources that I asked you to read for this class. Okay, this is one of them. It's written by a guy named Andrew of Fleury. Fleury is in northern France, and this is a monastery there. But this is part of a collection, of miracle tales associated with Saint Benedict, who was, of course, the patron saint of Western monasticism. But in this, we get a description of one of these peace of God protest movements. And this is not the first. Some of these date back to the first half of the 10th century. This one is in the early 11th century, and so this seems to be a quite organized and well-known phenomenon at this point. But let's just look at some of the thinking that goes into this. First of all, this is marked by what medieval people would have seen as a miracle. There seems to have been an eclipse. The sun was darkened and hid the rays of its splendor for the space of about 2 hours. Any sort of phenomenon like this was taken as a portent of God's disfavor with things, or that something spectacular was about to happen, right? If people saw a comet, or even a really spectacular falling star, or especially something amazing like an eclipse, right? They would associate that with either terrible things happening, or God's giving a sign that something significant is going on, right? So this eclipse marks this the beginning of this movement. Okay, the Archbishop of Bourges, which is in France, northern France, wished to impose peace in his diocese through the swearing of an oath. And so he gathers together all of the bishops of his province. An archbishop is like a bishop of bishops, so there are lots of bishops who are under the archbishop, and they hold a kind of council. And then they make all men of 15 age and over swear an oath. And people in the Middle Ages took oaths very seriously. And they kind of backed this by saying, well, if anybody breaks this oath, then we have the power to excommunicate them and bring down the wrath of God on them. This is the main weapon that the clergy have, okay? They also kind of associate this with saints. He says he swore this oath. So Aymon himself, the archbishop, takes this oath. Okay, and he says, I shall discharge with my whole spirit and without any guile or dissimulation everything which follows. I will wholeheartedly attack those who steal ecclesiastical property, those who provoke pillage, those who oppress monks, nuns, and clerics, those who fight against Holy Mother Church, until they repent, right? And this is nothing about peasants, but some of these peace of God oaths do say anybody who raids, peasant food stores is also under condemnation. And he swore this over the relics of Stephen, the first martyr for Christ. And so they've got some relics of an early saint here. They established essentially a kind of pact with all of the prominent men of the area, right? That they will oppose violence. And on pain of their mortal souls, the peril of their souls going to hell if they break this, right, is the idea. And everyone agrees, except apparently there's a knight named Odo who refuses to do this. And so Aymon then, as Odo attacks one of his neighbors and starts to commit some of this violence that they were worried about, Aymon says, while the blood of the innocents was not yet dry, he began to collect allies together from all sides. And he sends them against Odo and makes him obey this, essentially, right? I don't remember whether they kill him or take him captive, or what it is, right? There are accounts of miracles and things like that, but the judgment of God is rendered against the person who broke this oath of the peace of God and doesn't acknowledge this. Now, by the second half of the 11th century, this became ensconced in law. And the church was emboldened by this. And this is a time of church reform where the church is sort of coming into its own and establishing greater power for itself. And that's something we might talk about in greater detail in a later class. But they established this thing called the Truce of God, which is like a permanent peace of God oath, okay? And so this is the Bishop of Terouanne, and the Count of this same territory. This is another region of France. And this is the declaration, which is known as the Truce of God. And this is not the only document about this. There are lots of these from different regions, right? So this becomes pretty well established all over continental Europe. So the declaration says, you must observe the time during the time of peace, which is commonly called the Truce of God, and which begins with sunset on Wednesday and lasts until sunrise on Monday. During those 4 days and 5 nights, no man or woman shall assault, wound, or slay another, or attack, seize, or destroy a castle, a burg, or villa by craft or by violence. So you cannot commit an act of violence, is what this says, between sunset on Wednesday and sunrise on Monday. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you cannot fight, right? Even Monday morning, right? Early Monday morning, until the sun comes up, you cannot fight. Anyone violates his peace, he shall be exiled for 30 years as a penance. Otherwise, he shall be excommunicated by the Lord God and excluded from all Christian fellowship. And so, you are consigned to damnation. You're going to one of the circles of Dante's hell, right? If you violate this. And anyone who associates with the person who is excommunicated will have to do penance, and they are under pain of excommunication, possibly. And so there are severe penalties for violating this. And it goes beyond just those 4 days and 5 nights. And it also says, it goes into some detail. You cannot make a hostile expedition on horseback except when summoned by the Count. And all merchants have to be left alone. You can't rob merchants. They shall have peace from you. This is also a time when commerce is growing and, stability is being established again and all of that. And the peace and truce of God are a factor in that. You shall also keep this peace every day of the week from the beginning of Advent to the octave of Epiphany. Advent is in late November. Epiphany is on January 6th. So another month plus where every day of the week, including Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, you cannot fight. From the beginning of Lent to the octave of Easter. That's another, 40-day period, right? Between Ash Wednesday and Easter where you can't fight. In February, March, April, that kind of time frame. And from the Feast of Rogations, which is the end of April, to the octave of Pentecost, which is usually, early to mid-June, right? So another 40, 50-day period where fighting is not allowed under any circumstances. And so for a good part of the year, there is no fighting allowed. And the priests are the ones who have to kind of enforce this and to curse all who violate it. And anyone who violates this and says, I haven't done that, has to undergo this thing called an ordeal of hot iron, which I think we talked about in class, but this is a typical judicial proceeding in the Middle Ages. So people took this very seriously, and it was, in many cases, in the law codes that are being written in this period, there are a couple of law codes, the Sachsenspiegel and the Schwabenspiegel, that are written in Germany in the 12th and early 13th centuries. They have what's called the land peace, right, which is really just a kind of permanent form of the peace and truce of God. This limits what people can do to fight. And this is a challenge to the prevailing order of society, which included people who were defined by their status as a warrior. Meaning knights, kings, nobles, right? These are supposed to be the fighters. What are they supposed to do now that their chances to fight are limited? Their chances to extend their territory are limited. And it's from this context that the Crusades are, this is a factor in the Crusades. So we will talk more about that when we discuss the Crusades. But that, I think, is enough for now. So thank you very much.